Every dawn at exactly 5:17, through the mist that rolls in from the bay, a little girl walks two big dogs down an empty seaside street. No one knows who she is or why her route never changes. Every step traced like a ritual, every turn remembered by heart. But one morning, when the harbor bell strikes three strange notes and a faint light blinks through the fog, the neighbors finally realize they've been wrong about her all along. And the truth stops every heart on Harborview Lane. Chapter 1. 5:17 on Harborview Lane. At 5:17 in the morning, when the gulls were only just finding their voices and the bay still wore its blanket of gray, a little girl stepped out from the alley beside the bait shop and turned toward the water. Her name was Maya Quinn. She was small for 7, with a knit cap pulled low and a pink scarf that had faded to the color of seashells. In her hands were 2 leashes. On the leashes were Archer and Nova. Archer walked a half-step ahead, steady as a metronome, shoulders square, eyes reading the street. Nova drifted behind, ears pricked, the kind of alert that made people slow down without knowing why. Their paws tapped a soft rhythm on the old bricks, the same route every dawn. Past the barber's window with the striped pole, across the painted crosswalk, along the iron railing where the paint curled like flaked salt. They did not hurry, and they never wandered. They moved with purpose, as if the street itself expected them. Harborview Lane was a place that woke slowly. Porch lights blinked on. Coffee makers rattled in quiet kitchens. In the upstairs window of number 12, Haruto Sato pressed his palm to the glass and breathed a circle of clear in the fog. He had been an EMT for years and carried the habit of watching the world for patterns. He noticed that Archer always glanced left at the mailbox with a dented corner. He noticed that Nova paused 3 heartbeats at the storm drain by the stacked lobster pots. He noticed the little girl's hand signal, a small tap of 2 fingers, once, twice, and a squeeze on the leash. Archer shifted lanes. Nova fell in. Across the street, a teenager in a yellow beanie lifted her phone and framed the scene. Zoe Alvarez liked sunrise shots. She also liked numbers on a screen that rose faster when a story had mystery. Every day, the same child with the same dogs at the same time. The title practically wrote itself. She tracked them slowly, careful to stay behind a parked truck when Archer cut a glance her way. The dog did not growl. He did not have to. At the corner, Maya stopped at the rusted lamppost. She stood so still that the fog seemed to gather around her. Archer looked up the hill. Nova lowered his muzzle to the curb and listened, as if the street could speak. The girl reached into her coat and touched something flat and square near her heart, then let the coat fall closed again. 2 fingers tapped the leash. Archer and Nova shifted as one. They moved on. Mrs. Davenport opened her front door in slippers and a robe, the steam from her mug rising into the cold. She didn't step past the mat. She rarely did. Her eyes were the color of wet slate and held onto order like some people held onto railing in a storm. "Too early for big dogs," she said, to no one in particular. "Too early for any of this." The dogs never so much as glanced her way. The little girl nodded once, the kind of nod a child gives to an elder at church. It made Mrs. Davenport press her lips together, because politeness from a child is disarming when you want to be stern. Down by the fish market, the tide licked at the pier pilings. A bell buoy tolled out on the channel, slow and hollow, the sound you feel in your ribs. The street narrowed where the brick gave way to patched blacktop. Haruto followed at a respectful distance, collar turned up, hands in his coat pockets. He watched the small stops, the tiny rituals. At a low stone wall speckled with lichen, The girls set a smooth pebble on the top, just so, then moved on. A breadcrumb, Haruto thought, but not for people, for memory. Zoe filmed the pebble too, because details keep viewers. She whispered into her mic that the girl did this every morning, and that dogs aren't supposed to act like trained sentries unless someone taught them. She said a few other things that were more opinion than fact, because the internet didn't care which was which as long as the video was clean and the dawn was pretty. Through her earbuds, she heard a car somewhere back on the hill rev twice, impatient on a wet road. Maya reached the crosswalk at the blind curve. The curve had taken mirrors off trucks and the corner off one unlucky fender. The town had posted a sign years ago, but signs only help those who read them. Archer stepped forward and faced the street, blocking just enough of the lane that anyone coming fast would have to notice a living thing there. Nova angled behind Maya, not touching her, but close enough that she would feel warm breath if she needed to steady herself. The girl looked right, left, and right again, the old lesson taught by old hands. A van shifted gears up the slope. The sound arrived before the vehicle, a throatier growl than most, the kind that makes dogs lift their heads and grown men clench their jaws without meaning to. Archer's ears flicked. Nova's tail went still. Maya didn't move at first. She lifted her chin instead, eyes narrowing the way kids do when they're counting seconds. Haruto felt it in his chest before he saw it. He started forward, steps quick now, not wanting to run, not wanting to scare the girl or the dogs. "Hold," he said softly, a word that had lived in the back of an ambulance. He wasn't talking to anyone, and he was talking to everyone. The van slid into view, the headlights low, one of them fogged from the inside. It came too fast for the curve, too fast for the slick, too fast for dawn on a street that still belonged to gulls and coffee steam. Archer moved first, not with a leap, but with a planted, square-shouldered stand that shifted the van driver's attention the way a whistle cuts through chatter. Nova stepped hard to the left and pressed his shoulder lightly into the back of the girl's knees. The pressure said move now. Maya stepped back against the brick, her coat rasping the wall. Archer held the center line. The van's brake lights flared, then flickered. Zoe's breath fogged her lens. She pulled the phone down just enough to see with her own eyes, not through glass. Mrs. Davenport's mug stopped steaming as the door air cooled it. She didn't notice the chill on her hands. The van wobbled, corrected, and skated the paint with its right tires. It missed Archer by a clean foot because Archer had picked the spot that forced the angle. Because some dogs calculate in ways you don't teach, you only refine. The driver swore into the windshield and threw the wheel hard. The van bumped a puddle and sent a sheet of water up into its own wake. Then it rattled past. Too fast still, too loud for the hour, gone before anyone could make out the plate. Silence folded over the lane again, the kind that makes your ears ring after noise has left. Archer looked to Maya. Nova looked to Archer. Maya's hand shook once, then steadied. She reached for Archer's collar and rested her fingers on the worn leather, not tugging, just touching. Haruto exhaled in a long line, the way a person who has seen too many almosts lets go of one more. "You all right, sweetheart?" he asked, not stepping closer than the space the dogs gave him. Maya nodded. It was a small nod, but it was sure. She tapped the leash twice and squeezed. Archer drifted from the center line. Nova eased out from the brick. The little procession crossed the street and continued toward the bay, as if dawn had not just tested them. From her doorway, Mrs. Davenport lowered her mug and watched the back of the girl's knit cap disappear into the fog. In her living room, a picture frame hung on the wall above the mantel. a man in a fisherman's sweater, smiling on a day long before the storm that took him. She set the mug down on the hallway table and pressed her palm over the old ache in her chest. "Too early for big dogs," she said again. But this time the words did not leave her mouth. Zoe stayed where she was until the van's sound faded to nothing. She checked the clip. The near miss was in frame, clean as a whistle crack, the dog's stance sharp against the white line. She thought of posting it right then, quick and hot. Instead, she watched the tiny figure and the two dogs slide along the rails toward the pier, the fog lifting in slow veils ahead of them. A bell buoy answered the small world of the street, with one deep note that carried all the way to the houses on the hill. Haruto fell in behind at his deliberate pace. He counted the girl's steps to the next lamppost and closed the distance by half. He wasn't certain yet what he was seeing. He only knew the feeling he got before a call that mattered, the sense that a routine was not a routine at all, but a promise being kept. He tucked his scarf into his coat and followed the glow of the harbor through the thinning gray, listening to the soft click of paws on brick, the quiet of a town not yet awake, and the steady, certain breath of two dogs who knew their street. Offering. Chapter 2. Signs in the Fog. By the time the bakery lights blinked on and the first batch of rolls hit the ovens, the fog had thinned to a gauze and the street showed its seams. Haruto Sato walked with his hands tucked into his sleeves, letting the girl and the dog stay a half block ahead. He wasn't chasing, he was studying. Years in an ambulance had trained his eye to catch what most people miss, the way trouble telegraphs itself in tiny rehearsals. What he saw now wasn't trouble. It was choreography. At the dented mailbox on the corner of Willow and Harborview, Archer checked left and held still one breath longer than any pet would bother to. Nova angled his head, not sniffing, listening, a strange patient pause as if sound itself ran along the curb. Maya tapped two fingers against the leash, then pressed her thumb and forefinger together once. Archer drifted a foot outward, opening a narrow walking lane that let the girl pass the leaning trash barrel without bumping her shoulder. It was small, so small you'd miss it if you were late for work or worried about bills. Haruto did not miss it. Across the street, Zoe Alvarez hugged her phone under her chin to keep the mic out of the wind. She had posted a clip after the near miss, nothing dramatic in the caption, just the timestamp and a handful of words. Comments began to climb like ivy. Some were kind, some were not. The number that mattered was the share count, the one that tells you a story is leaving your hands and stepping into the wider world. She told herself she was filming to protect the kid if anything happened again. She told herself that twice as she crossed behind a parked sedan to keep Archer's line of sight clean. Maya paused at the rusted lamppost and reached into her coat. She took out a piece of chalk the size of a cigarette butt. With quick, neat strokes, she drew a small arrow at knee height, pointing toward the seawall. She rubbed at the line with her sleeve to smear it into the texture of the post so it wouldn't scream for attention. Archer stood between her and the street, while Nova kept his head low to the storm drain, ears tight, reading the hollow under the road the way a hand reads a chest for breath. The girl tucked the chalk away and moved on. Haruto stepped to the pole after they passed. The arrow wasn't the only mark. There were numbers ghosting beneath it, almost gone to weather. 7, 3, 1. He didn't know what they meant yet. He only knew they were repeated ahead, faint as old scars. He brushed the metal with his thumb, felt the grit, and pictured a smaller hand doing the same thing every dawn. He looked up the street where the girl had gone and gave himself permission to quicken his pace. Mrs. Davenport stood at her window with the curtains pinched between two fingers. the way she had done since the hurricane that took the power out for a week and her husband 2 months later. She watched the child with the dogs and felt the old ache line up with the new irritation. Her phone vibrated with the neighborhood thread buzzing to life. Videos, opinions, a simmering pot of grown-up worry and gossip. She typed half a sentence, "We need to," then stared at the blinking cursor until it felt like a clock ticking. She set the phone down without sending. At the second stop, the stone wall facing the bay, Maya placed another smooth pebble on the top, exactly 2 inches left of yesterday's stone. Haruto measured it with his eye. Not random. He glanced down to the water. The tide was turning, sucking back through the channel in a quiet hurry. He thought of a margin note he had seen on a training card years ago. At turn, noise carries farther under the lip. Zoe drew nearer, phone chest high, lens steady. "People want to know who's with you," she said softly, not to spook the dogs. "Do you have someone waiting at home?" It wasn't a hard question, but it fell wrong in the air like a fork clinking on china in a church. Maya did not answer. She touched the flat square in her coat again and kept walking. Archer looked back with an expression only a dog can manage, something between patience and warning. Zoe lowered the phone half an inch and let them go. By the fish market, the road dipped and the drain grates widened. Nova's front paw slid into the lattice with the ease of practice, claws catching the rung just enough to test for looseness. He pulled back and shook once, satisfied, and moved on. Maya counted out loud under her breath, not quite a whisper. 1, 2, 3, and tapped the leash. Archer sidled closer to the curb until his shoulder brushed the worn paint, giving her the inside toward the storefronts. A delivery cart squealed through the alley. The dogs did not flinch. The girl blinked and did not turn her head. Up the hill, a city clerk named Nolan Pierce sat behind his desk and paged through the morning's inbox. Mrs. Davenport's complaint had arrived neat and complete. Bullet points lined up like soldiers. Hour, route, size of animals, risk to pedestrians. He filed it in the system and put a sticky note on his monitor to call animal control. Procedure was procedure. He did not see the video that Zoe had posted. He did not know the curve on Harborview Lane. Paperwork has a way of making a place look flat when it isn't. Maya's fourth stop lay at a wooden kiosk, where old fishing maps curled under fog-stained plexiglass. She wiped the surface with her sleeve and pressed her palm against a corner where the seal had lifted. Moisture bubbled beneath, trapped like breath on a cold day. Archer stood facing the street again, a living bollard. Nova angled toward the water, nose lifting, drawing the damp air in and holding it as if scent had layers, and he was peeling them back with care. Haruto stood 2 paces off Maya's right shoulder and spoke gently, not as a stranger, but as a man who had said calm things in bad moments. "Those marks you make," he said, "they a game or a route?" The girl looked up at him. Her eyes were the color of the inside of a mussel shell, dark with a ring of light. She seemed to weigh his question, then lifted her hand and traced a little arrow on the fogged plexiglass with the tip of her finger. It pointed seaward. She let it fade and looked back to the bay. Zoe's phone buzzed with a direct message from a woman who said she had seen the child by the old lighthouse earlier in the week. Zoe's heart gave a jump that was part curiosity and part the reflex of a hunter hearing brush move. She started to type a reply, and then stopped when Nova's ears snapped forward so sharply that even she felt the change in the air. The fog thinned in a long breath. Out beyond the seawall, the channel bent between 2 dark humps of rock, and the bell buoy tolled once, then again, The second strike longer, lower. A gull dipped, corrected, and rose against nothing anyone else could see. Nova leaned toward the drain, head cocked, listening so intently that time itself seemed to lean with him. Archer's tail stilled, his chest rose and held. The girl turned her face toward the water and closed her eyes, as if someone had whispered her name from a far room. Haruto felt the hairs on his arms lift. He stepped one pace closer and then stopped because Archer cut him a glance that said, "Hold your place." The street made its small sounds. Shoes on brick, a door latch, a spoon in a cup. And under that, something else. A faint, hollow carry like a knuckle rapping wood beneath the boards. The old EMT in him named it without wanting to. A sound traveling through a channel, changed by distance and tide. He put 2 fingers to the rail. The metal thrummed a note so soft he would have missed it if he had not been touching it. Maya opened her eyes. She whispered a word Haruto did not catch. A word shaped to fit the mouth of someone who had learned it at another's knee. The dogs shifted together, Archer turning seaward, Nova lifting his paw and setting it gently on the grate as if telling the earth to be quiet. The world seemed to pause and listen with them. Zoe forgot her phone for a full 10 seconds. The lens drooped toward the bricks as she stared past the railing, trying to see what the dogs were hearing. When she remembered to lift the phone again, her hand shook. On the screen, you could see none of what mattered. You could only see a child, 2 dogs, and a strip of pale water breathing in and out. Mrs. Davenport's hallway clock chimed the half-hour. She found herself at the threshold without remembering how she'd gotten there, her robe belt untied, her slippers whispering against the runner. She looked down the hill at the tiny figure by the maps and the 2 steady shapes bracketing her. "Who taught you that?" she murmured, not expecting an answer. Haruto cleared his throat and spoke in the low voice that belongs to people who have been inside rooms with bad news and tried to show the way out. "You hearing something, kiddo?" he asked. "Or feeling it?" Maya turned her head just enough to acknowledge him. She lifted her hand and tapped the chalk nub inside her pocket. Once, then closed her fist around it. Her face softened in a way he had seen on grown men who finally knew which road to take. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. The bell Bowie tolled a 3rd time, and somewhere under the street, a small, hollow knock answered it. Faint as a memory. Nova held the sound in his body. Archer marked the line of it with his eyes. Maya touched the rail, then the map, then the space over her heart where the flat square lay hidden. When she spoke, it was barely above the hush of the bay. "Not a game," she said. "A route." Haruto felt something settle into place behind his ribs. He looked at the girl, then at the dogs, and then out to the gray water that kept its own counsel. The marks on the lampposts, the pebbles, the pauses, the way the dogs mapped the air. None of it was superstition. It was a language. He had been hearing it all his life without knowing. The 3 of them stood that way, man, child, dogs, while the sun tried to punch a pale hole in the fog. The street pulled in a breath and held it. And in that held breath, with the bay whispering under brick and iron, Haruto understood what his hands had been telling him since the girl first stepped from the alley. Archer and Nova weren't just looking. They were listening. And what they heard was not the street at all, but the sea. Chapter 3. The Gray Lantern. The fog loosened its grip on Harborview Lane and slid back toward the water in thin bands. Maya turned away from the kiosk and headed for the footpath that ran along the seawall. Archer took the inside toward the rail. Nova drifted to the edge where the cobbles broke into sand. Haruto let 2 couples with coffee pass him on the narrow stretch, then kept the child in sight, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to lose the thread. Zoe followed too, the phone down now, her eyes doing the work. Past the bait shop and the boatyard, the path bent toward the headland where the old lighthouse rose, chalk white and weathered, its windows blind, its lantern long ago stripped. Folks still called it the gray lantern because of the way storms stained the glass and left a permanent hush around it. Maya climbed the shallow steps like someone who had counted them before. At the lee side, where a plank door had warped and never closed right again, she pulled a length of twine and the door gave with a sigh. Inside, it smelled of salt, old rope, and the iodine bite of antiseptic. Light came down the spiral like a slow spill. The girl did not climb. She crossed the stone floor and knelt by a square of boards near the base of the stair, boards rubbed smoother than their neighbors. Archer stood between her and the doorway. Nova took a position facing the far wall, head low. Maya pressed her fingers into a small notch at the board's edge and lifted. A trap door came up on a leather hinge. Haruto stopped in the threshold. He could see enough without taking another step. Inside the shallow cache lay a tight roll of gauze, a brown bottle with a hand-lettered label, a bundle of clean rags, 2 coils of thin rope with their ends whipped, and a shrink-wrapped life vest made for a child. At the bottom, a notebook sat inside a freezer bag. The bag was fogged with age where it had been opened and closed many times. Maya took it out with both hands and cradled it like a thing that was both precious and in use. Zoe stood behind Haruto, one hand on the frame to steady herself. "You seeing this?" she whispered, and then flushed because of course he was seeing it. Maya set the notebook on her knees and unzipped the bag. The cover was stiff with dried salt. In the corner, in block print as neat as a carpenter's chalk, was a name, E. Quinn. The pages held sketches and notes at once plain and exact. Arrows showed wind sets at dawn through the year, each month a different drift. Margins carried words written without flourish. At 5:17 in spring, the turn begins. Listen to the drains and the bell. Check 4 points. Do not skip the wall. Later entries noted boat names, dates, and little phrases that were only half about weather. If fog like wool, the sound won't carry clean. If gulls dip twice, look at the channel split. Haruto leaned in a fraction and felt the old familiarity of a field card. Compressed experience distilled to help hands act when hearts were racing. Maya turned a page and paused at a photo taped crooked to the paper. The tape browned at the edges. A woman in a weather jacket and knit cap smiled at someone out of frame. One hand rested on a dog's harness. The dog was Archer, a little darker around the muzzle now, but the same square gaze. Another shot showed Nova at a pier with a bright orange line in his teeth, water streaming off his coat. Underneath, a note. Retired, but not finished. Haruto shifted his weight. He knew the woman's posture before he knew her name. Service people have a way of standing that makes sense of their height. "Your mother?" he asked softly. Maya nodded, eyes on the page. "Captain Elise Quinn," she said, a child's voice drawing a woman's title with care. She kept lists so the sea couldn't lie to her. Zoe swallowed. She realized the phone was still in her hand and slid it into her pocket. The girl's fingers traced a map sketched in pencil, the lines dark where they mattered. 4 dots marked land points along the harbor. A 5th sat where the channel narrowed near the bell buoy. Next to it, the word "if" in capitals, underlined twice. The plank door clicked again. Haruto turned, expecting a gust. Instead, a shadow crossed the threshold and resolved into Mrs. Davenport. Breath a little quick from the climb, hands empty. She stood with her chin up the way she did at neighborhood meetings, but the line of her mouth had softened. "I heard voices," she said. "I shouldn't have, but I did." Her eyes dropped to the open store of gauze and rope and the child's small hands on the notebook. For a moment, she looked older and younger at once, like someone hearing a hymn from a church she hadn't entered in years. Maya closed the notebook with a care that made no sound and slid it back into the bag. She lowered it into the cache and laid the life vest on top. When she stood, she did it in one motion, practiced as a liturgy. Haruto stepped back to give her room. Archer moved with her. Nova's ears pricked. He looked toward the doorway and held. From up the path, a voice called, and then another. Boots on stone. Nolan Pierce appeared, out of place among ropes and rust with his city shoes and the folder tucked under his arm. He blinked at the chalky light and found his target. The dogs, the child, the man who clearly was not their owner. "We've had several complaints," he said by way of greeting to the room. "We need to sort this properly." Mrs. Davenport bristled, then surprised herself by lifting a hand as if to stall him. "She's in my district," she said, and heard the odd note in her own voice. Nolan, relieved to find a familiar chain of command, squared his shoulders. "All the more reason to follow process. The notice is ready." He opened the folder and read in the clipped tone of office business. "Effective tomorrow at dawn, pending assessment by animal control, 2 large canines will be removed for community safety, pending proper guardianship, housing assessment, and handler certification." The words sounded reasonable because paper makes them sound that way. In the little lighthouse belly, with the coil of rope catching light and the child holding still as a bird, they sounded like something else. Haruto kept his voice level. "There's no danger here," he said. "There's record of training. There's purpose." Nolan did not look at the notebook. He looked at the clock on his phone. "We'll evaluate all that," he said, and shut the folder with a neat tap. "Tomorrow, dawn." He glanced at the dogs and took a half step back without meaning to. "Please, have them ready." Zoe took a breath, as if to fire words downrange. Archer's head turned, and she held them. Maya nodded once, like someone agreeing to a rule so the ceiling would not fall. Nolan, feeling he had done a tidy thing in a messy room, gave a small, tight smile and left. Mrs. Davenport stayed. The dogs did not move. Outside, the fog breathed against the walls. The bell buoy sounded once, softened by distance. Maya lowered the trap door, set her palm on the worn board, and whispered, "Thank you," to no one anyone else could see. She led Archer and Nova back into the light. Haruto and Zoe followed. Mrs. Davenport walked a step behind, as if the narrow path had known all along where it wanted her to be. Down on the seawall, the afternoon had thinned to the kind of gray that makes boats look like charcoal marks on paper. Word traveled the way it does in towns that pretend not to gossip. By supper time, a rumor had made 3 turns and arrived at the harbor master's office that the little girl with the dogs would lose them at first light. Vic Marino, who had watched men argue with weather and lose, poured coffee into a chipped mug and stared out at the channel. He didn't call City Hall. He didn't write anything down. He listened. Night came in pieces. Porch lights clicked on one by one. The bakery closed its till. The bait shop pulled its wooden sign in from the hook. Haruto sat by his window with a book open and unread in his lap. Zoe checked her video drafts and left them as drafts. Mrs. Davenport washed a single glass at the sink and turned it over to dry without thinking about it. Maya was a square of darkness at a small upstairs window, the shape of Archer at her feet and Nova's soft breath on the floorboards. The notebook lay on a chair back under her coat, as if a shoulder were still inside it. At 5:16 the next morning, the town was a held breath. 1 minute can be very long when you know what waits at the end of it. The fog returned, lower now, close enough to taste. Maya stepped from the alley with the leashes in her hands. Archer's step was the same as always. Nova's too. They reached the crosswalk at the blind curve. No van came. The street gave them back their sound. Maya stopped at the rusted lamppost and touched the metal with her fingers, as if waking it. She did not take out the chalk. The bell buoy tolled, a deep sound that rolled along the water and into the iron of the rail. Haruto, farther back than usual so the child would not feel watched on this hard morning, laid his hand on the rail to feel it travel. Mrs. Davenport stood in her doorway with her robe tied. Zoe, uncharacteristically, left her phone in her jacket pocket. Maya turned to the seawall and lifted her eyes. The fog was thin out by the third bell. For a breath, there was nothing but gray. Then, from the spot where the channel pinched and the tide ran fastest, a light blinked. 1, 2, 3. The pause was exact and terrible. Then the beam burned long, steady like a held note. Then 3 short again, crisp as knuckles on a wooden door. SOS belongs to no one and to everyone. It is older than complaint forms and younger than grief. Archer lifted his head. Nova's paw found the grate as if to still the earth. Maya's hand closed on the leash until her knuckles were pale. She looked out at the place where the water narrowed, and someone was asking the world to listen. She spoke a single word, shaped for that hard, bright moment. A word that fit the sea and the stones, and the memory spiraled down inside the lighthouse. Anchorage, she said, and the morning gathered itself like a body about to move. Chapter 4. Orders in the Fog. They gathered at the blind curve just before first light, the fog lying low like wool pulled over the lane. A white city truck idled by the curb, the door stenciled with animal control. Officer Lena Cho stepped out with a clipboard under her arm and her dark hair pinned tight. She wasn't unkind. She was the kind of steady the towns lean on when the rules have to be the rules. She spoke to no one in particular, voice even. We'll do this calmly. We'll keep the animals together. Maya stood with Archer and Nova at her sides, one hand on each leash, her feet planted on the old paint of the crosswalk. Haruto was farther back than his heart wanted, hands open at his sides. Zoe kept to the rail, phone in her jacket, not lifted yet. Mrs. Davenport had come all the way down the steps and was standing 2 houses from her door, robe-tied, face pale and set. The bell buoy sounded once, low and sure. From the harbor office, Vic Marino jogged down the slope, winded, a radio clamped in his fist. He didn't waste the hallway of words people use when they are scared of the important ones. We've got a man in trouble, he said, eyes on the water, not on the clipboards. Tomas Rivera went out alone before dawn. His skiff drifted. Last return on the handheld was near the 3rd bell. Officer Cho's eyes moved from the child to the harbor master to the fog. She listened the way good officers do, with her jaw still and her mind running. A second tone came over Vic's radio, a burst of static, then nothing. Out beyond the seawall, a faint, steady light blinked 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, then held. Archer lifted his head and marked the exact line of it. Nova's paw slid to the grate and stilled the rumble in the street like a hand on a drum. Not a coincidence, Haruto said, because sometimes naming the obvious lets the room breathe. He stepped to the rail, measuring angles without a ruler. The current's pinching hard around the bell. If he's in the water, he's riding the inside curl. We won't see him until the last 10 yards. Officer Cho raised a hand, palm facing her own crew. Hold, she said quietly. She looked at the dogs, then at the girl. "What's the command, Maya?" The child's lips moved around a word that had been carried to her on a woman's breath and tucked into her ear like a prayer. "Anchorage," she whispered. Archer squared to the channel and set his weight. Nova turned, ready to go where the line went. Vic grabbed a coil of rescue rope from the back of his truck and looped it over the rail. Haruto shrugged out of his coat and tied a bowline across his waist so fast his hands remembered what his head had not done in years. "I'll go the rock line," he said. "Keep the angle shallow or we'll be pulling against the tide instead of across it." Zoe lifted her phone now. Not for shock, not for views, but because someone might need to know exactly what happened, and there would be no paper forms that could carry it right. "Live," she said softly. The single word, a promise, not a headline. Her lens found the line, the dog, the child, the water. Officer Cho took the free end of the rope and wrapped it twice around a post, anchoring her own weight behind it. She glanced at her crew. No tranquilizers. Nobody moves these dogs unless the handler tells you. If we pull together. It was not the speech she had thought she would give when she woke. It was better. Maya knelt and put both hands on Nova's collar, face close to his ear. "Easy," she breathed, and then, "Go." Nova took the line in his teeth and stepped to the edge where the cobble fell into sand. He did not leap. He slid, body long and low, and knifed into the shallows without a splash. The rope paid out from Vic's hands in a clean hiss. Archer paced the rail, eyes locked on Nova's head as it rose and fell with the small, mean chop of the pinched channel. Haruto ran the line of rocks that curved out like a broken finger toward the bell. He timed his steps to the wave lift, boots gripping the slick dark. "2 more yards," he called. Not loudly, not for drama, but so the sound would mark distance for the people holding the weight. Nova angled toward him, hauling the line past the break where the current kicked sideways. He found the set and swam across it, not with the frenzy of panic, but the economy of a creature who had learned to save breath. The light blinked again. Through the fog weft, a shape surfaced and slid back, the chopped bow of a small skiff riding wrong, then a hand, then a shoulder, then the face of a man who had long since burned through his shout and was down to the quiet kind of begging. Haruto went chest deep at the last rock, caught the rope Nova held, and set his feet against the pull. "I've got you," he said to the man and to the dog and to the morning. On the wall, Officer Cho leaned back and took the rope's strain, her soles locking, her body becoming a cleat. Vic lowered his stance and took a rap. Mrs. Davenport stepped forward and set her hands on the line without asking who would approve it. Zoe kept the frame steady, breath tight, voice low. "They've got him," she said. "For the handful of people watching and the many who would watch later and understand why towns are worth saving." Maya braced the rail between her knees and spoke to Archer the way a mother speaks to a child who is frightened but listening. "Hold," she said. Archer's tail flicked once, impatience checking itself. Nova dropped the line long enough to take another breath and found the rope again, teeth setting in the same place as before. Haruto reached the skiff, got one arm under Tomas Rivera's. The man's eyes were glassy with salt and effort. Haruto put his mouth near the man's ear. "You have to help me help you," he said, that old sentence that makes a partnership out of fear. They moved as one thing then, not pretty, but right. Nova pulling point, Haruto angling the weight around the rock lip, the team on the wall taking in slack on the breath and easing on the fall. At the curb, Archer shifted 3 paces right, sighting along the rope not because he could pull, but because he could aim the hands at the good ground. The fog thinned, the bell spoke once, and the three bodies rose out of the gray in pieces. The man's arm, Haruto's shoulder, Nova's head, until all of them were on the stones and the rope lay dark and quiet between them. Haruto rolled Tomas onto his side and cleared water from his mouth the way muscle memory knows to do when thought is slow. "Breathing," he said, checking the pulse that hid and then came. "Cold. Get blankets." Officer Cho had them there before he finished the word. She dropped to one knee without a care for the grit and covered the man chest to thigh. "Ambulance is on the way," she said. But she said it more for form than for comfort. The work that saves lives had already been done. Nova stood with his ribs working and his eyes on Maya. Archer pressed his shoulder into the child's hip, grounding her the way she had grounded him more times than anyone had counted. Haruto looked up at the people at the rail. "We're good," he said, and sat back on his heels with a wet laugh he hadn't meant to let out. Mrs. Davenport's hands stayed on the line even after they had laid it down. Her eyes shone in a way that made her look like the woman in the wedding photograph in her hallway, the one who trusted the future as if it were a boat that always came back. "He kept a notebook," she said into the damp air, words surprising even herself. "My husband. About the curve. About the bells. I didn't listen like I should have. I'm listening now." Officer Cho rose and faced the girl. She had paperwork on her clipboard that had sounded sensible yesterday in a warm office. It sounded thin now, like a raincoat in a squall. She slid the papers under her arm and looked at Archer and Nova and the small person who had said a word and set a street in motion. "We're not taking them today," she said. "We're not taking them at all, if I can help it. We'll do a proper evaluation with the harbor team and the rescue captain. Until then, they stay with their handler." Maya nodded once, sober as an adult and soft as a child who can finally let a breath go. Nova shook the water from his coat in a long arc that spattered everyone on the wall. It made Zoe laugh on a hiccup, the kind of sound that fixes a moment in memory. She lifted her phone and finally spoke into it. Voice steady now. "This is Harborview Lane," she said. "It's dawn. They pulled a man out of the channel with rope and a word and 2 good dogs. If you've been saying this was a nuisance, maybe you should come down and bring a blanket." The ambulance siren came thin through the fog as the paramedics eased onto the lane. Vic walked over to Officer Cho and tipped his chin toward the lighthouse. "That girl knows a route," he said, "and somebody taught it to her, right?" Cho glanced at Maya, then at Haruto. "We'll write it down," she said. "But first, we'll keep it safe." They loaded Thomas with care and shut the doors with the practice of people who do things every day that feel like firsts to families. Mrs. Davenport picked up the rope and coiled it. Not neatly, not like a sailor, but with the earnestness of a person doing the next right thing with her hands. She set it on the rail and turned to Maya. The apology that had been building in her throat was too big to fit through at once. She settled for a hand on the girl's shoulder and a small nod that said, "I see you." The fog thinned another shade. The bell buoy gave a last slow toll and fell silent. Archer stood square and calm. Nova leaned into Maya's leg and sighed a long sigh that emptied a worry older than morning. Officer Cho clicked her pen closed and tucked the clipboard under her arm like something that could wait its turn. On Harborview Lane, the day began again, this time with coffee passed down the rail and blankets folded over elbows and the low hum of voices that sounded less like complaint and more like a town remembering its manners. Chapter 5. The Legacy Comes Home By afternoon, and the fog had burned off to a pale blue that made the bay look rinsed and harmless. Word ran along Harborview faster than any tide. The girl and her dogs had pulled a man from the channel, and animal control had stood down. People who claimed they didn't follow neighborhood chatter somehow knew exactly where to walk and how slow to go. They arrived in 2s and 3s with thermoses, old blankets, and the careful faces of folks who suspect they owe an apology but haven't found all the words. Maya sat on the low step outside the gray lantern with Archer's head in her lap. Nova slept at her feet, ribs rising slow, a damp halo darkening the stone where his coat still shed the morning. Haruto stood a little off to the side, taking it in with the measured quiet of a man who understood that sometimes the best thing you can offer is steadiness. Officer Cho had come back without the city truck, just herself and a notepad she never opened. She leaned against the rail and watched the street remember how to be kind. Zoe crossed the path with a paper bag from the bakery and set it beside the girl. "Warm rolls," she said. No camera. It was the truth. Her phone was in her pocket, screen dark, the morning's live stream already climbing through, the web on its own legs. She had left it alone. Some stories don't need steering. Mrs. Davenport approached with both hands around a chipped mug. She held it the way people carry breakable things when they're not sure of their own grip. Her voice came out lower than usual, worn around the edges. "I brought tea," she said, and after a beat, "And I'm sorry." She stared at the dogs so she wouldn't have to stare at the child. "My husband kept notes on the bells, on the curve, on the way sound carried when the wind turned. He was a man who thought you could fix a thing if you documented it. I laughed at the time he spent writing what we already knew. He went out one night when the fog had a mind of its own and didn't come back. I've been mad at everything loud and unscheduled since." She swallowed and tried again. "You were never the problem. I just didn't know where to put my fear." Maya stood and took the mug in both hands, careful as a ceremony. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She didn't have to. She sipped and nodded once. Archer blinked slow, which in dog language is mercy. Harbor Master Vic Marino climbed the steps with a folder that had lived in the bottom drawer of his desk for years. He set it on the step, flipped the cover back, and laid out laminated incident cards clean as a deck. Time, wind, tide, visibility, response. Older cards were handwritten, later ones printed. The ink changed, the bones stayed the same. He tapped 2 with his forefinger. "These 2 are Elise," he said. "Your mother." He didn't make it a question. Pulled a capsized dory off the eastern flats with a line and a shepherd named Archer. Helped me bring in a broken-mast sailor at the North Rip. She wrote better notes than any of us. He lifted his chin toward the lighthouse. "You keeping her route at dawn is not a quirk. It's continuity." Maya slid her free hand into her coat and drew out the freezer bag with a salt-stiff notebook. The zipper rasped. Haruto helped ease the pages open to the place marked with a scrap of red twine. The map of the harbor showed 4 dots on land and 1 in the neck of the channel. In the margin, 3 lines in block letters. "If you can't see, listen. If you can't hear, count. If you can't count, hold to what you know and wait for the bell." The words had no poetry and all the strength in the world. Zoe crouched, elbows on her knees. "There's more," she said, eyes on Maya. "I didn't want to bring it up while Thomas was still in the ambulance. The van this morning, the blue one coming in too hot. Folks in my comments swear it's been parked nights by the old cannery. Same van pops up in a few posts about cash drops along the boulder cut." She hesitated. "I looked at the plates in my footage. It's registered to a Pierce." Nolan Pierce has a nephew with a landscaping business and a cargo van. I don't know if that's the thread, but it's a thread. Haruto glanced toward the town hall, then at Officer Cho. Cho didn't look surprised. Good officers rarely are. "We'll pull traffic cameras near the cannery," she said, "and I'll call in a quiet look at the plates. Whatever this is, we'll handle it without setting the street on fire again." Nolan Pierce chose that minute to appear at the bottom of the steps. Jacket sharp, tie straight, the look of a man who expected a meeting to obey an agenda. He carried the same folder as in the lighthouse, corners crisp. He started to speak the way people start at podiums, a shallow breath and a practiced phrase. Then he saw Tomas Rivera's soaked jacket hanging over the rail, the coil of rope drying in the sun, the child with the notebook, the dogs who didn't blink for him. Something inside the script faltered. "I came to discuss the next steps," he said. The line sounded foolish in the open air. Officer Cho stepped forward just enough to make space for him to retreat if he wanted to. "We're not taking the dogs," she said, and her tone left no room for paperwork to wriggle. "We are, however, going to talk about traffic near the cannery and a blue van tied to after-hours deliveries. You can come to that conversation as a neighbor, or I can write you into it with a badge. Your choice." Nolan's lips parted, then closed. He looked at his shoes and found the step with his toe as if the wood might tell him how to be. "Neighbor," he said finally. It was thin, but it was the right word. Mrs. Davenport surprised herself a second time in one day by cutting a glance sharp enough to slice ribbon. "You might start," she said, "by reminding your nephew this street is not a shortcut to be bullied at sunrise." Nolan nodded, swallowed, and nodded again, like a man learning to bow. Vic lifted a small portable speaker from his folder and set it on the step. "Found this in the harbor office back room," he said. "It used to sit in the watch when Elise was on nights. It plays a recording through a loop. We used it to test the bell pattern against channel drift after the storm. I thought, well..." He didn't finish because he didn't need to. He thumbed the switch. A soft hiss, then a clean tone, then a woman's voice reached up from the little box, warm and work-ready. The sound of someone who lived in weather and made sense of it without sentiment. "If you're hearing me, you're at the lantern and something needs doing," the voice said. "Check the wall. Check the drain. Put a hand on the rail and count till you feel the hum. If the bell gives you 3 and the current's pinched, don't wait for a second guess. Throw rope on the breath, not on the fall. And if you can't decide, trust Archer. He always knows where the line belongs." The recording clicked and looped, a round of instructions worn smooth by use. Maya stood very still. She had never heard her mother's voice from a box, just from memory, and one old voicemail she played on nights when the wind fussed at the siding. This was different. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a hand on her shoulder telling her what to do next. She reached down without looking and found Archer's ear. He leaned into the touch and sighed. Haruto cleared his throat and spoke as if to the room and also to the part of the past that still sat at the top of the stairs. "We can formalize this," he said. "Call it the Dawn Watch. Keep the route at 517. Train whoever wants to learn the listening. Choirs get better when more people know the melody." Zoe's mouth curved. "I can tell that story without showing faces," she said. "The route, the bell, the why. People will send blankets before they send opinions." Officer Cho flipped her unused notepad shut and slipped the rubber band back around it. "I'll write the memo," she said. "But I'd rather write the training schedule." She looked toward the harbor. We started the day ready to take 2 dogs. I'd like to end it asking them to teach our rookies how to read a tide. Nolan steadied himself on the new words, like a man finding the right rail in the dark. I'll rescind the removal notice, he said. I'll file the withdrawal. He sounded relieved to have a sentence that fit his hands. And I'll talk to my nephew. He added the last part softly, but he added it. Mrs. Davenport glanced at the little crowd, at the dog sleeping with his paws twitching, at the child with the notebook, at the lighthouse that insisted on being useful even without its glass. We could put a box on the step, she said, surprising herself again. People can leave dry towels, spare gloves, a note if something felt off at the wall. Not a suggestion box, a signal box. Vic nodded like a man whose shop had just received exactly the part he'd been trying to name. They stayed until the sun slid low and turned the lantern honey gold. Tomas Rivera's wife came up the path, with her hands over her mouth and tears already shining. She said thank you too many times, and not enough. Because that's how it is when fear has almost finished its story and then refuses. She pressed a small envelope into Maya's palm. The girl looked at Haruto. He nodded. Inside was a folded note and 2 crumpled bills and a pressed sprig of sea lavender. The note said, in careful English, "For the dogs who pulled my husband back, and for the child who knew the word to start them." When the light thinned to pewter, folks drifted off in 2s and 3s as they had arrived, quieter now, as if leaving a church that had not asked for them to kneel. Archer rose and shook. Nova yawned so wide his tongue curled. Maya tucked the notebook back into her coat and stood at the top of the steps. She looked at the water, then at the street, then at the people who had learned a little new language in a single day. She didn't announce anything. She didn't have to. The route was already waiting, inside the hour tomorrow would bring. Behind her, the speaker clicked, and the woman's voice came round again, steady as a bell. If you can't see, listen. If you can't hear, count. The words walked out across Harborview Lane and settled into corners where fear had been living alone. And the town, which had been bracing itself against a child and 2 dogs at dawn, exhaled and took the first easy breath it had drawn in a long time. Chapter 6. Same street, new meaning. They named it the Dawn Watch on a Tuesday, and no one argued with the name. It fit the way an old coat fits a cold morning. Vic typed it on a single sheet and pinned it to the harbor office corkboard with a brass tack. Officer Cho wrote the training schedule in block letters you could read from the doorway. Rail, wall, drain, bell, rope. Haruto added times and tides, and a short line that said, in smaller print, "We listen first." People who had never met at any hour before sunrise signed up without clearing their calendars. Zoe made a flyer with no faces and posted it at the bakery, the bait shop, the church. Mrs. Davenport put a clean wooden box on the gray lantern steps and painted signal on the lid in tidy handwriting that didn't shake. The town set the ceremony for Sunday at first light, because you don't honor a dawn practice at noon. Lanterns hung from porch hooks. Coffee steamed in paper cups that said Harborview in blue ink. The little speaker sat on the step again, its plastic scuffed from years in a drawer, ready to carry a voice much bigger than itself. Tomas Rivera stood with a blanket around his shoulders and his wife's hand inside his elbow. Nolan came without a folder. He brought his nephew, who looked 10 years older than he had a week ago, and held his cap in both hands. Maya arrived the way she always did. Quiet, on time, with Archer and Nova bracketing her like the edges of a well-made frame. She wore the same knit cap and the same faded scarf, and the same small, steady expression that had carried her through a season of questions. She stepped to the rail and laid her fingers there while the bell buoy tolled once. The sound ran up the metal and into her hand. She nodded, a child checking the world for its shape. Vic cleared his throat and tried not to make a speech. "We're here because a little girl kept a promise we didn't know existed," he said. "And 2 dogs remembered what their work was for. We're going to keep that work honest." He lifted a clipboard and then, thinking better of it, set it down and looked out at the water that had taken and given back in equal measure. Officer Cho stepped forward with a half smile that had more miles on it than years. "I came to Harborview last week with a form," she said. "I'm leaving the form at the office and taking a lesson instead. The lesson is simple. Sometimes the thing that looks like a problem is the muscle a town forgot it had." She turned to where Archer sat square and Nova leaned into Maya's knee. "I don't give medals," she said softly. "I write schedules. But I can say thank you." Zoe lifted the little speaker and clicked it on. Elise Quinn's voice spilled into the morning, steady as a hand on a tiller. "If you're hearing me, you're at the lantern and something needs doing. Check the wall. Check the drain. Put a hand on the rail and count till you feel the hum." The crowd went still. People who had never met Elise looked at the lighthouse and felt, for a breath, that they had. Nolan stepped forward with his nephew at his side. The young man cleared his throat like gravel in a jar. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes on his cap, not on the child. "For the van, for the curve, for thinking morning belonged to me." He lifted his gaze and looked at Archer the way a man looks at a guardrail that held. "It won't happen again." He slid a set of keys across the rail to Vic. "We're donating the van to the harbor if you want it. Paint it any color you like." A hush rolled through the crowd that wasn't the kind people used to punish. It was the kind that lets a wrong thing get turned the right way. Mrs. Davenport nodded once, decisive as a stamp, and that settled it. Haruto held up a leather folder, the kind commanders use for maps. Inside were photocopies of the old cards and fresh sheets with blank lines. He passed them like hymnals, and a murmur rose as folks read the simple measures. Wind from the east at dawn. If the bell runs heavy, hold the throw low. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, don't hesitate. People pressed their palms to the rail and counted. Not because anyone told them to, but because the habit was worth borrowing. A volunteer from the church handed Maya a small box wrapped in butcher paper and tied with twine. "From the quilting circle," she said. Inside lay 2 oilskin coats sized for Archer and Nova, hand-stitched with their names. Maya's mouth made a small O, and then closed again around the kind of smile that travels to the eyes and stays there. She slid the coats over the dog's shoulders and fastened the straps with fingers that didn't shake. Archer stood still the way a dignitary stands still for a sash. Nova wiggled once and then squared, as if remembering himself. Tomas stepped forward last. His wife squeezed his arm until the blanket creaked. He took a breath you could hear. "I don't have many words," he said, "but I have a debt." He held out an envelope thicker than the one he'd given at the lantern steps days ago. "For the Lighthouse Fund," he said. "Not just a bulb, a keeper." Vic glanced at the amount and blinked hard. It wasn't a token. It was a start. "Anonymous, if you please," Tomas added. And the crowd understood that a man who has been pulled from cold water wants the gift to be the story, not his name. They didn't cut a ribbon. They didn't need one. Instead, Haruto walked the first rail lesson like a preacher walking a short aisle. He set a hand on the iron, waited for the hum, and counted aloud. People followed, fingers trailing the same metal. Officer Cho showed how to lay a rope so it runs clean, not under a boot. Vic pointed along the channel neck, explaining why the bell can lie on a hard north wind, and how you listen around the lie. Zoe filmed none of it and all of it at once. Memory first, camera second. The small recorder in her pocket capturing the sound of a town learning a new prayer. When the light lifted from pewter to pearl, Elise's voice clicked off, and the bell buoy fell quiet, as if breakfast had been called. Folks drifted into the lane. Someone pressed a cinnamon roll into Mrs. Davenport's hand. She tore it in half and gave the larger piece to Maya without fuss. That, more than speeches and envelopes, told the truth of the morning. Before the crowd broke, Vic raised a weathered logbook with a leather tie and a torn spine. "One more thing," he said. "We found this in the bottom of a locker behind old file boxes. It's the harbor log from the same year Elise started. Looks like the front cover was lost in the storm." He opened near the back and ran a finger along cramped entries. Some rescues have initials. Others just say pulled with line team at dawn. He looked up. Those entries match the mornings the bell pattern cuts short, like the bell deferred to the work. He turned the book so the front page caught the light. The first line, almost erased, came clear when the sun hit it square. Keepers don't sign. The water knows. A soft sound moved through the crowd, not applause, not a hymn, something in between. For a moment, Harborview carried the weight of a sentence no one needed to argue with. The hour reached 5:17 without anyone forcing it. Maya felt it before the clock on the church turned. She wrapped the leashes around her small palm and looked at Haruto. He nodded like a coach, telling a runner to trust the legs that brought her. Officer Cho stepped aside. Vic tipped his cap. Mrs. Davenport tightened the ribbon on the signal box and stood back. Maya tapped the leashes twice and gave the light squeeze. Archer shifted to the front. Nova floated to the rear, the little formation falling into itself with the grace of muscle memory. They set off along Harborview Lane, the same bricks underfoot, the same curve waiting, the same gulls arguing over things that didn't matter. Windows opened. People leaned in their doorways with cups they forgot to drink from. The bell buoy tolled once, rich and sure. It sounded less like warning and more like a benediction. At the rusted lamppost, Maya rested her fingers, not to leave a mark, but to remember where the marks had been. At the stone wall, she laid a new pebble next to yesterday's and felt the line of days stack up into something strong. At the kiosk, she wiped the fog from the map's corner and pressed the seal flat with her palm. Archer glanced left at the dented mailbox. Nova paused at the grate and listened, then moved on. The town watched and did not intrude, a hard lesson learned and kept. At the blind curve, the blue van did not appear. A different truck rolled through slow and stopped to let them cross, the driver lifting 2 fingers in a small salute the way men used to do on back roads. Archer set his feet. Maya looked right, left, right again. She felt Nova's breath steady behind her and the rails hum in her bones. They crossed. On the far side, Zoe let out a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. She lifted her phone, then lowered it again. Some endings don't want a frame. They want a lane and a bell and the sound of paws on brick. Maya reached the seawall and stopped the way she always did. She looked out to where the channel pinched and the bell rode the tide. For a passing second, the fog thinned just enough that you could almost swear a taller figure stood with her, hand on the rail, eyes on the water, head tilted in the shared habit of people who listen for what others miss. The moment passed. The lane held it anyway. They turned back the way they came, small and sure. The two dogs easing the child through the morning, and the morning easing the town through itself. When they reached the lighthouse steps again, Maya touched the signal box and smiled to no one and everyone. The street, which had once whispered about a strange child and her two big dogs, stood silent with respect and then, as if released by the bell, broke into warm claps that rolled up the hill and faded into the kind of quiet that means home. Every dawn she walked two dogs. The neighbors finally uncovered the truth, and it stunned the whole street, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. A promise kept, a route held, a town taught again how to listen to the place that made it. And the gray lantern, which had lost its glass and kept its purpose, watched with the patience of old things that know their hour will come back around if they wait. If this story touched your heart, take a second to leave a simple comment. Just type 1 if you felt something, or 0 if you stayed until the very end. Your little click tells us you're still out there, listening with us at dawn. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story waiting on the horizon. Another quiet miracle, another life that might just change how you see the world.